Hello everyone. Right, we are just, I can see our attendees flooding in, so we'll give everyone a minute or two before we start the workshop. Very excited to see you all. It's been, well, in fact, we can't see the attendees, but very excited to see the panel members. We've had an exciting day so far at the London Funders Festival of Learning. Yes, it's been very exciting this morning. I was in a session earlier about how organisations had delivered differently as a result of London community response grants. And you're now joining the session on the equity and inclusion approach that was taken by the London Community Response Collaboration. Right, I think I will start with dive into the introductions. So first of all, welcome to the Festival of Learning. London Funders, if you don't already know, is the membership network for funders and investors in London civil society. And our work is all about enabling funders from all sectors, independent funders, corporate funders, public sector funders, to be effective, to collaborate, to connect, to cooperate. And all of that is about helping people across London's communities to lead better lives. We're really excited about having you here today. We're on day one of the festival, which runs over 6 days. And the point of the festival is about bringing together our members to share reflections and learning from the last extraordinary year that we have lived through together. We want to highlight the amazing work that civil society organisations have done, and also the way that funders have worked differently together. And we want to share some of the learning on what's worked really well and also on what didn't work. And all of that is about building a springboard for action as we move into recovery, for action by the funding community on progressive change that makes the capital a better place for all Londoners. So this meeting is due to run till just before 3 o'clock. Before I hand over to Bonnie, who is going to chair this session for us, just a quick overview of the London Community Response for those who haven't been involved in it. There are a number of sessions on it woven through the festival, so you will hear plenty about it. But the highlights are 67 funders came together to make sure to get money to community organisations in a way that was fast, simple and equitable, in order that community organisations could respond quickly to the changing needs of their communities. So over the last year, there have been 5 waves of funding. The first wave launched 4 days after lockdown. The final wave that's finished at the end of March. And over that whole year, nearly 3,500 grants were made, and which equates to £57.5 million in funding, with the fastest grant being made within 48 hours of the application being received. So very, very different way of working for funders. But more than that, part of the way through the second wave, the London Community Response invited 4 equity partners to join us, some of whom are on the call today. And those equity partners were helping funders shape the programme, advising funders on how to assess applications, how to make decisions on applications, and also doing outreach and support to organisations who were applying. We then also appointed Bonnie from the Social Investment Consultancy to join us as a learning partner. And the question we asked Bonnie to explore was about what can we learn from this approach to equity that was taken during the London Community Response, and what does that mean for funders going forward. So this workshop and a report, which has just been published today and is on our website, there should be a link in the chat, are part of the way of answering that question. So Bonnie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Geraldine, and welcome everyone to our hopefully a very practical session with insights coming from Vivian from the Women's Resources Centre and Tracy from Inclusion London, two of the equity partners involved in the London Community Response. So my name is Bonnie Chiu from the Social Investment Consultancy. I'm just going to share my screen so that you can kind of look through the agenda for today. But we'll start, I think Geraldine already gave a really helpful overview to London Community Response. So we'll just add a bit more context to that from an equity perspective. Then we'll do a very interactive run through of the grant making journey. So thinking through really step by step, what did we do in each step? And to make this as interactive as possible, please do use the Q&A function, or I think the chat function, whatever you prefer, so that we can tease those questions in as we go through the grant making journey. We'll be sure to get you out of this room by 5 minutes to 3 so that you can stretch your legs before the next thing that you've got to do. So really the objectives of this session is, first of all, to understand the how. So how did LCR, London Community Response, actually embed equity throughout the grant making process? Knowing that it's mainly grant makers that we're speaking to today, we want this to be practical for you and that you have some concrete takeaways. The second question is also to reflect a bit on what works in embedding equity and what needs to be done more. But this will just be a very quick overview, but hopefully it will entice you to read the report, which we've already shared the link in the chat. So just a quick context setting. Geraldine has already said quite a lot about LCR, but from the equity context specifically, LCR made it really clear that they want to make sure they are channeling grants to organizations that are led by communities and groups that have been most affected by the COVID crisis. So taking really an equity lens to this. And these are also organizations that have been historically underfunded. So out of the total amount that's been channeled through LCR, the exact amount that was channeled to equity-led organizations, and we have changed the definition actually quite a bit during the waves, but we'll touch upon that a bit later. But we are looking at leadership of these organizations, and the leadership of these organizations being from kind of different groups. And the groups that we're looking at specifically are Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, LGBT communities, disabled people, and women and girls. So looking across all the whole LCR, the different waves, we've channeled more than £28 million in the past year to equity-led organizations. We've only started tracking the data halfway through wave 2. So the wave 3, 4, 5 data are the most accurate ones, and you can see from the percentages that they have represented around more than 70% of each wave. There's a slight drop in wave 5, but that's also because we have increased the threshold for equity-led organizations. Previously, leadership is defined as 50% coming from a certain group, but wave 5, we have increased that to 75%. And that was also actually as a result of the learning that we were doing around wave 3, wave 4 time, and realized that we need actually a more stringent definition that's in line with the current definition of disabled people's organizations. We'll talk more about that. I also want to touch upon intersectionality very quickly. We are, of course, looking at 4 different pillars, as I mentioned, but it's also important to recognize that actually groups funded, sometimes they are led by groups facing more than one category of disadvantage. And in our data, around 27% of those groups funded are actually facing intersectional disadvantage. And this this table maybe is a bit complex, so you have to take a look now, but that's also in the report. You will see kind of across the waves, the various pillars that we're tracking, where there's ethnic minority women being kind of the most popular or common intersection, but we also see kind of 2 or 3 intersections playing out as well. So that's just a bit of context that we shouldn't forget, that while we're talking about equity-led groups and that we have the various equity partners that represent a specific community, they are not in silos. And that's also actually a really strong point of London Community Response, that we're able to look at equity more holistically. So who are the equity partners? I already mentioned the 4 pillars, and today we have represented Women's Resources Centre and Inclusion London, but Ubele and LGBT Plus Consortium are also part of the equity partners, and they are also doing their respective sessions throughout the Festival of Learning. The equity partners were funded by the pool fund that came from City Bridge Trust, but they are equity partners for the whole of LCR, the 67 funders partnership, as Geraldine pointed out earlier. And just a bit about why the equity partners were initially appointed. LCR recognizes that it needs to strengthen the reach of the program and to ensure that the groups working with the most affected communities are supported to apply for funding, and to also for the equity partners later on to provide support to the whole funder partnership to really strengthen LCR's approach and really being a critical friend. So having talked to the equity partners, these are just some of the bullet points on the right, what they found valuable about LCR. But of course, what better than me speaking about it than actually hearing from the 2 equity partners we have. So if I can ask Tracy first, if you can speak a bit more about your role as equity partner in LCR, and just what you felt has made the biggest difference.
Yes, thanks, Bonnie. Really great to be here. Just very briefly, I'm the CEO of Inclusion London, and we are a pan-London infrastructure organisation run by and for deaf and disabled people. We support approximately 70 local deaf and disabled people's organisations in London. Yeah, just kind of an overview. I think firstly, being involved in this initiative is probably one of the most positive things that I did last year. So it was really, really valuable, and hopefully I can communicate why. We've done some really interesting collaborative work with a few, kind of 2 or 3 individual funders. But I think what we haven't done before is come together as a group of infrastructure equality organisations and work together to influence and work with a group of funders. So that was absolutely new. And I think the kind of detail of that has made all the difference. I think key things for me is just been that, you know, it's been great to kind of meet amazing other leaders of these infrastructure organisations. And I think working together, we really strengthened and kind of easily found some consensus around the key equity messages that we all shared. And that was about the importance of funding and investing in marginalised communities ourselves and funding community self-organisation. And so that was expressed through our focus on advising and encouraging this funding initiative to really focus on user-led organisations and related things like a focus on core funding. So it's great to have that pan equality lens and work with sister infrastructure organisations. I think the process was genuinely collaborative with London funders as well. I think kind of looking back, we were involved both kind of operationally, but also strategically, and from the outset and across all the stages. So that's kind of setting funding aims, direction, looking at guidance, right through to advising on kind of funding panels. So genuinely collaborative at all the various really key important stages. I think for us, it was that also being funded really helped, but it was that kind of combination of being a critical friend to London funders in this process, but also being funded to do that outreach and support to our members, and particularly our members that we know would not take up this funding opportunity otherwise. So I think that's kind of broadly what made the difference for me,
Thank
but it
you
was
so
really
much.
positive.
Thank you so much, Tracy. That really spoke to some of the bullet points here. And yeah, if I can turn to you, anything to add about the role of Women's Resources Centre as the equity partner?
Cool.
I think, Viv, sorry, I do have to ask you to unmute yourself. Was hoping to avoid saying that.
Sorry, I thought I was on mute. Did you hear anything I said?
No, if you can start again.
Well, good afternoon and thank you. Yes, I think Tracy's given a really good summary of the process, and I would reiterate and agree with everything she said. I think some of the really important and unusual things for us as infrastructure organisations was being recognised as a source of intelligence that funders don't have. And I think that's part of the critical role that specialist equality infrastructure organisations play. And I was very pleased to see that not only acknowledged, but honoured in, as Tracy said, that we were funded to do this work, because most of the time when we're invited to share our expertise, whoever that's with, we're not remunerated. And that again leads back to what Tracy mentioned about the need for core funding for the whole of our sector, which has been a cry that we've probably heard for at least 25 years. So I'm pleased that we were able to reiterate that, and that I know some funders felt able to give those core grants. I think it's a first what we did. As far as I'm aware, what we did is unique. And probably quite brave, because funders are in their own world and we're in our world. And although I think we have the same aims, which is a more fair and equitable London, we do very different things and we have very different experiences. And importantly, we have really different knowledge and expertise. And I think for me, being involved in all of the process, from looking at the criteria, which was critical, and I think Tracy said that we really made the case for the funds to be directed to led by and for organisations. And I think for us, that's about our sector. I'll talk about the women's sector, but it applies across the board to equality sectors. For our sector, our members, the service delivery orgs, if you like, they're not just about providing services, they're about achieving women's human rights. And if, as a funder, you want to achieve women's human rights or everybody's human rights, then I think that requires funding the led by and for, because what you get from those organisations is a focus on human rights, not just delivering services. So you actually get more bang for your buck, in my view. Yes, I think being part of the panel making decision for me was a great learning opportunity. And I think the funders would say it was probably a learning opportunity for them.
If we can pause on that,
Okay.
so that we
Sorry.
can take people through the
Okay.
journey a little bit. But thank
Okay.
you. I think the point you made just about being on equal footing really with London funders to be able to shape LCR, as well as with other funders in the collaboration, and being able to really strengthen that focus on led by and for, which has been shown through the statistics. So, 28 million going to equity led by and for organizations. I think that's definitely not common. So if funders or other audiences in the room, if you have questions, please do let them come in, because I think there are lots of takeaways just from what both of you said around how funders can genuinely work with organizations like yourselves and how to make that relationship truly equitable and not exploitative. But turning then to the nitty-gritty of grant making process. So we'll kind of look through 4 really important steps in LCR, just kind of thinking through what you did practically. So we'll first start with outreach and then think through the application process, sifting, and then funding decision. So what we're going to do now is in each step, we'll cover very briefly what LCR did in terms of equity, and for both Tracy and Viv to share with you all what you have been doing. I have my colleague Yishan, who will then just be capturing notes on Jamboard, so that all of us will have just a collection of what has been discussed today. But yeah, please do feel free to add your questions in the chat as I go through each of those steps. So the first step, outreach. I think, yeah, what I want to understand from both Inclusion London and Women's Resources Centre is, how do you reach out to groups to get them to apply? Will some groups not have applied if you didn't reach out to them in the first place? So yeah, Tracy, would you like to start?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the big thing here was that we were funded and therefore had the capacity to do this work. So the actual work itself was the kind of stuff we do, but it was the fact that we could do it. So we obviously publicised the funding programme and made all of our members and the wider DPO sector aware of the funding, but our capacity, the kind of additional work that we did was we really identified groups that we knew might not take this up, would not kind of think about it, would assume that it's not for them, and might not have heard about it. So we did a lot of outreach work, so contacting, phoning, emailing, and then really working with those groups to find out what they need, and then really to get that fitted into the funding programme. So it's very much about understanding what they needed to do in response to COVID, and then working with them about how they could present that and make the case in the application form. So some of our work was just about making people aware and organisations aware. But I think just under 20 organisations we actually supported in terms of advising about actually writing the bid, what probably should be in it, what shouldn't be in it, looking at budgeting, etc. So we did some intensive hands-on work with a number of DPOs, most of which I believe were successful. So that was not all of them, and that's quite interesting as well. Yeah, I think that really hands-on work and the ability to support somebody to actually make the application, not just kind of talk about the fund and make people aware of it. It's actually support to write the application and submit it.
Yeah, and I know when I interviewed some of you and the other equity partners, an appeal for some of the groups in your network is that their application will be seen by more than one funder, that is actually seen by a collaborative group of funders. So it feels that, well, the time they put in, and of course also the support you give, it is worth putting in the effort. If any any reflections from you on this outreach process? What have you managed to do that perhaps, you know, in other instances you couldn't do?
Thank you. I think yes, because we were resourced to do this work, so we were able to do more than we would have done otherwise, which obviously for our members, we promote any funds that we think are suitable for them. But that's quite, compared to what we did here, that's in quite a superficial way. I think you just mentioned, Bonnie, that we understood the detail of the funding, for instance, that the applications would be seen by more than one funder, which is critical if you think about what your percentage chances are. I think the other thing that we did, because of COVID, we were having weekly, then fortnightly emergency meetings with some of our members in London. We were able to bring it to their attention. We were able to do additional outreach. We also held webinars, and we held a webinar with London funders attending, which those kind of things are completely crucial, because then the organisations get to ask the direct question of the funder. They're really helpful. But also we provided one-to-one support around the application process. And from that work, we had a really good high return on the members that were successful. So yeah, I think that was that really improved how much money went into led by and for organisations.
Thank you. And Geraldine, it would be good from a LCR perspective, if there's any, if you can comment whether, yeah, what the equity partners have done.
Well, I think that you know, funders have said to me, you know, there were organisations that they had never seen before applying for funds, and funders were delighted to be able to make you know, funding relationships with those new groups. So that was a real success. From the London funders' point of view, having kind of regular engagement with the equity partners about what was coming through the pipeline, knowing what to look out for, you know, if there were any questions about those particular applications, being able to go back and understanding you know, why those applications were important, and being able to track them through the system. We wouldn't have been able to do that without the work of the equity partners.
That's great. Yeah, so I guess a key takeaway with outreach is really compensating for infrastructure organizations' time that actually already, organizations that has the reach already into communities and that could support organizations, particularly those that are not used to the funding world, to come forth and apply. So yeah, any other questions on outreach, please do put in the chat, but we'll move on now to, oh, they're just, something just came in. So how do you ensure, yeah, you're not molding organizations into what you want them to be? Outreach is good, but is all the information you ask for necessary, or just another way to control who makes it through the process? So maybe that's also a good opportunity to talk through the application process and actually the application criteria that I know both, well, all the equity partners have given some feedback initially on the application form and what good looks like, what information you should ask for. So Viv, would you like to start first on this?
Thank you. Yes, we were engaged through London funders with reviewing the whole process of applications, from the criteria setting, which we spent quite a lot of time discussing actually, and then through what the forms look like and the questions that were being asked. I did find that question that just popped up very interesting actually, which I think is talking about the power dynamics that go on. And also I think for me, this process has been amazing and I want it to continue, because I think we've got more work to do in terms of how some application processes are actually prohibitive for some organisations. But that's a whole nother conversation, I think. But thank you for that question.
I wonder if that question might also be asking about your role as infrastructure organizations, and that you're acting, you're paid by funders to do this, and how can you make sure you're not just molding the organizations to be what, you know, London funders thinks they should be?
Well, I think for us, our work is to support the women's sector and to support their independence, and we take a human rights based approach, which necessitates that we don't police organizations or tell them what to do. You know, we know that organizations working in their communities know their communities the best, and if they say, well, look, that's not working for us, then we listen to them, and then we would have reflected that back to London funders. You know, we're not gatekeepers. Certainly my organisation isn't, and we would never be that. Our job is to influence the people with resources rather than change the people who need the resources, because they know what the needs of their communities and service users.
That's really, really great. And yeah, Tracy, do you want to respond to what Viv just said, but also any other points you want to make around application process, how you supported that?
Yeah, no, just echoing what Viv said, really. I mean, I think it's very much, and I would say this very confidently about all partners, that it was about understanding what our organisations and our members want to do and supporting them to make that case in the application form rather than the other way round. I mean, I think strategically, I think the moulding question is really important, and that's why for us as a group of organisations, we really wanted and want to continue to have that dialogue about the importance of core funding, because that's a real counter to increasingly prescriptive project funding. And I think our view is that, you know, yes, organisations need to show they can do the work, and that we need that due diligence done. But if you understand how social change is brought about, it's always brought about by communities themselves, and you've got an organisation that shows it can do the work that's needed, then for us it's absolutely about trusting and investing and frankly handing over the money to the organisation so they know what they can do, what they need to do with it. And that's the kind of essence of core funding for us. And I think that's a really strategically important way to counter kind of very prescriptive funding that ends up lots of people chasing, kind of, you know, going down rabbit holes to get funding, and that's never good. And we're very clear about that in the capacity building work and advice that we give organisations.
Great, thank you. We do have, Geraldine, would you like to come in?
Yeah, just a very quick reflection on this. It's so useful having the equity partners work with us on the design and the development of the application form over time. So in the second wave of funding, we started asking a question about, you know, are you led by one of these communities? And by the fifth wave of funding, that had become a very nuanced set of questions. So, you know, there was a question about led by, and the threshold for what that meant changed, the description of it. There was a question about who your work was for. There was a question about how you did that work, whether you did that in a kind of human rights way. So actually what funders had by the end of, by the final wave, was a really rich set of information to make sure they were getting their money to the right places. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without the equity partners.
Thank you. And actually, Geraldine, while you are speaking, if you could also turn to this question that has just come through in the chat. I remember us discussing the application form, and it was all 4 equity partners together in the room and debating, because each of you have slightly different views, but it is the debates that make the relationship and the whole collaboration so rich. So this question is about the collaboration of all the 4 partners and what made this effective. And we already heard from the introductory remarks that you found the Penn Equalities approach and working with sister infrastructure organizations really useful. So yeah, Helen asks, as funders, we often engage infrastructure organizations on a bilateral basis. It's felt that there was something unique about the collaboration of the 4 equity partners themselves. So Geraldine, if you can kick us off, and then for the other 2 to comment.
I mean, yes, it definitely was unique, and it's certainly my first experience of having worked with the kind of pan equalities collaboration, and I think there was some really interesting learning along the way about how we all work with each other. So it was those 4 equality organisations, and then a group of the strategy group of funders, which was I don't know, about 10 of the key funders involved in the London community response. So very rich discussions, not always easy discussions, but I hope discussions that have shifted the dial quite significantly. So I think it would be, I think we really need to hold on to this, and we really need to not go back to the old ways of working.
Yeah, and I guess it's also then about London funders convening that space with the other equity partners, but you don't want to hold that relationship just to yourself. You really want to make sure the equity partners are also speaking to each other and are having their own conversations. Yeah, Viv, do you want to comment on this point? What works about kind of collaborating with with the other 3 equity partners?
I think probably the key thing is that we spoke with a collective voice on principles and, if you like, a strategic approach, because obviously there are nuances about our specific communities, but also across those communities, because we're the Women's Resource Centre. We work with a whole range of women's organisations. We're not issue-based, so we have Black women's orgs, disabled women's orgs, Latin American, we cover off all communities of women across our membership. And so that kind of the gendered lens that is then intersectional is always critical to our work. But I think working together, we understood that our concerns from within our membership are all really, really similar. And therefore it was quite powerful, I think, for 4 different sectors to be saying the same things. I think sometimes if it's just one organisation saying something, it might not be as strongly received by whoever you're giving it to. So I think the fact that we all were led by and for, core funding, what's the definition of led by and for, how is that application process going to land with small local organisations who don't have professional fundraisers, and who find the whole process very time consuming, that we all were saying the same things, really. So I think that was really powerful.
Great, yeah. So yeah, part of it is finding common grounds, but also recognizing the organizations you support. Back to that intersectionality slide, they are not just siloed in those different pillars, but if we all speak together, then you're much better to support, especially those facing intersectional inequalities. Tracy, any thoughts from you around the equity partners collaboration with each other?
Yeah, I mean, I just echo absolutely what Viv says. And I think, for me personally, there was something just great about being in a room with other people that were saying the same thing, and it's not just you. And that's kind of when you're talking about power and power relationships, just having kind of that solidarity and that kind of shared collective voice was great, and actually just makes you realize how often it's just you saying that in a kind of funding situation or lots of other situations. And I think that we absolutely have to hold on to this and build from it. And I think really starting to look at kind of intersectionality is something that we're in a better position to do now as a group of organisations strategically in terms of infrastructure and joint working, and to do that with funders that can fund that kind of that development would be great. But yeah, I think it's been absolutely key. And I just kind of echo again how absolutely kind of how easy it was to come to that consensus about, you know, what are the key messages that tackle structural inequality, and they are the same and they are shared across all of our communities, which made it very easy really to find that common ground.
Great, thank you. So yeah, then moving kind of through to the application process, you've supported organizations to apply, you've tried to make the form simpler and, you know, share feedback to London funders, so we adapted throughout the waves. So after then the applications come through, there's a sifting process. So the different funders, they have the sifters that do the work. And it was around wave 3 that it was found that with the increasing focus on equity, that sifters are not always well placed to comment on the equity and inclusion dimensions of the applications, or not aware of the local dynamics. And there was also another question that came into the chat, that funders might usually expect organizations to have really good websites or really strong online presence, and the groups that come forth may not have that. So can you just tell us whether you did anything to support the sifters, to really provide them with that nuanced understanding of what your members, the groups you're in touch with actually face in terms of their realities? So yeah, Tracy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so I think the kind of central work that we did with the sifters was our business advisor that was doing the outreach work and supporting our organisations, our sectors organisations to apply. We also did some sessions with the sifters, and that was kind of, as you said, educating around the importance why, you know, for us in the disability space, when still so many organisations that are in this space are not run and controlled by, not led by, how important user-led organisations are. And I think just, yeah, kind of doing that education, because I think I was a bit worried at some point that we would get kind of stuck on the stat about, you know, over 50% and then moving it to 75%, which is really important, but it's being able to understand why that is so important behind, you know, why that control is so important. And I think being able to work with sifters on that and that kind of nuanced understanding, and I think kind of particularly also developing that ability to look and go, is this organisation doing this from a human rights perspective? And I think one of the things that we really wanted to get across is it's not just not, if you're working in the disability space, if you're not having a human rights approach, that's not just a neutral position. We would argue that that's actually a negative, counter undermining position, because the nature of the discrimination that disabled people face, we need that approach. So it's just kind of understanding kind of the implications and just helping people think through what that means. So you might get an application that looks great, but it's completely, you know, no disabled people involved in running the service. It comes from a very therapeutic or medicalized model, and we've been able to show why that actually is very damaging to individual disabled people going through a service like that, when they're just viewed as kind of passive recipients. So yeah, I think alongside the funding panel, which we'll talk about in a bit, I think it's just really having the opportunity for us as equity organisations to sit down with funders at various levels strategically or in the business of making decisions and sifting, and to have those conversations. And I guess I'm quite shocked that we haven't been doing this forever. And I think it's something we really do need to carry on doing, because, you know, we're at the start of that journey. And I think there's a lot more sharing and learning and development together that we can do, really. So I really hope it doesn't stop.
Yeah, Viv, anything else to add around sifting, or otherwise we'll move to the very exciting decision making part?
I don't think I could really add to anything that Tracy said. I absolutely 100% agree with everything she said, and the whole idea of that exchange of expertise between funders and infrastructure organisations. I think it means that the money gets to the right places.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we'll get to the funding decision then. And there was also a question that came in that if we have time, we can revisit that. But so across the waves and in Wave 5, one of the funders, the City Bridge Trust, you were invited to be part of the advisory panel meetings. And I know Shagufta, I think, is also dialed in, who chairs the panel, and we do actually have a testimonial from her. But before I go into that, Viv, do you want to start with how was that experience, being part of the advisory panel, and what difference did you think you made there?
Yeah, well, again, it was a first for me. I don't know if it's a first for the funders, but it was a learning for me to sort of trying to get into the mindset and the functioning of funders, which, being from a fundee org, if you like, usually, you know, there's a difference there. So that was good to understand the challenges that they have in terms of making quick decisions, so many applications, and actually the pressure that they're under as well. But I think the benefits to human rights work, if you like, because of the detailed intelligence that we have about organisations across London, not just in terms of what makes a led by M4 org, but also we would have some kind of knowledge about a lot of the organisations who were applying. So if the assessors had questions, often we were able to clarify those just from the intelligence we had. And so I think we were able to ensure that the right groups, if you like, in terms of human rights, led by M4, doing something that is an identified need, and there's nobody else doing it as well in the led by M4 sector, was really great. And I think it just made me realise, and I think Tracy's alluded to it, we should be doing this all the time. It's it now feels obvious that it's the right thing to do, because the funders have their expertise and we have ours. And again, if we've got a shared vision, which I think we do have in this case, then we can achieve so much more together. And I think when you showed the stats, Bonnie, that's what you can see. And I think long term, this kind of approach, working collaboratively with equalities infrastructure orgs and funders, will actually has the opportunity to shift some of the structural inequality, because this is the way to do it, because our orgs are the ones who are on the front line fighting for people's human rights. And also evidence shows that you achieve that through this kind of independent collective action.
Yeah, Thank you so much. And Tracy, if you can also reflect and just, yeah, to be succinct for 2 minutes, then we can, yeah.
Yeah, like Viv, I've never done that before, and it does make you appreciate what a job funders have. Sometimes you kind of sit there and go, that must be, you know, quite an attractive job to have, but we can really see the challenge of it. I mean, I think for me, again, it was that kind of nuanced conversation underneath the question, is it user-led or not? So I know we had some really interesting questions about a lot of organisations that were applying, that were providing services for younger disabled people, but had no evidence of anybody that was providing that service being a disabled person. And just being able to kind of unpack the possible implications of that was really helpful. And for me, I think it just showed we really do need to work together to identify where we see gaps in what we want to see happening and being funded. So for me, there's a huge gap around enabling DPOs to work in that space with disabled young people and that intergenerational work. How can we have that conversation together to meet that unmet need? And that can only come about through kind of working together and kind of identifying firstly that is an issue and that is a problem. So yeah, I think just being able to kind of work through operationally individual applications kind of was really fascinating.
And so, yeah, I mean, you will see this quote from Shagufta, and not only the equity partners as well, the other two who were not here today, but have added a lot of value also to the panel discussions. You really see the value you have added. But I think your last point, Tracy, is also you then learn something from this panel, and you can already take it back to your work, and then you identify something that you can address immediately. And often we don't really have those feedback loops, because what stays in the panel meeting stays in the minutes, and the funders don't have those links into communities to make a change directly, but you can. So I think that's also an additional value that we can be capturing. We have 2 more questions that have come in. One is about barriers, kind of what application sifting assessment process in particular are prohibitive or barriers to funders supporting led by and for. I think I would turn to probably asking the person who raised that question to read the report, because I think we've touched upon it quite a lot on the report. But yeah, I will read also the other question, which perhaps we can address very quickly here. Importance of user-led. What was the reasons to increase from 50% to 75%? And yeah, if the percentage of those led by is really high, could there be a danger that different groups could become insular, which result in less understanding amongst general public? Yeah, so I think, Tracy, I would love to give you the floor to share the definition, the rationale, and why it's so important, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we operate, and the Disabled People's Rights Movement operates, the kind of minimum definition is 75% of kind of governance management committees, and at least 51% of staff, including senior staff. The reason why that's so important to us is that is a counter to tokenism. So there is a whole history of, well, there still is a history of predominantly organisations working in the disability space not being run and controlled by disabled people. And when there has been this kind of push because of the movement to get a bit more representative of the people that they're working for, you find that, if it's around 50%, that, it can still be incredibly tokenistic because lots of different power dynamics going on. And it also, we do know that there is lots of people that attempt to fit into a 50% category. So I think 75% is a clear marker of intent, and it does really filter out lots of organisations that aren't genuinely run and controlled by. Why that's so important, I would need probably another year to say, but it is vital, because that's the way that you support community self-organisation, through funding by and for organisations.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think, yeah, the equity partners all agreed with that increase. So that's why we have changed that definition in Wave 5. And well, more to come with the learning. So just quickly to say, well, time has flown by. I hope all of you have taken some lessons learned from our fantastic equity partners and of course London funders on how to embed equity in this step-by-step process. We have our report, which launched today, as Geraldine mentioned. So please do give it a read. It has the best graphic design I've ever seen. So hopefully it will be a very interesting read through 20 pages. We'll also be doing an update to this learning process as Wave 5 concludes, and we're doing more deep dive learnings as well with some of the funders. So yeah, do stay in touch and stay tuned. But Geraldine, passing to you to wrap us up. Thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, and huge thank you to Bonnie and Viv and Tracy for running such an interesting session. I wish we'd set this up as a 2-hour session, rather, because we could talk longer on this, couldn't we? There are, in the rest of the festival, there are other sessions coming up on similar issues. So we have Bailey, we have the LGBT Consortium and the Baobab Foundation all running their own sessions. We've got funders for race equality. We've got an open discussion on equity, and we've got Bonnie back again on Monday morning to talk more about the practicalities of equity in grant making. So huge thanks to everybody. This has been a really, really inspiring process to be part of, and we look forward to continuing to work with our equity and inclusion partners and to really, really shift the dial together. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.